So today I'm talking about the Open Source Apt, and by that, really I want to focus on sort of a troubling trend, because a troubling trend in tool sets and retooling. A variety of APT groups, whether they're completely well-resourced or lesser resourced, are starting to deploy more and more open source, making tracking and delineating activity all the more difficult. At the same time, there's a dilemma in adopting open source and using it, and we'll take a look at why that's a problem for the actors themselves. So I'll be talking about a handful of tools. There are more than this that are out there being used, that are open source projects and being favored right now by APT. But I'll be looking at a reliance on Beef, Unicorn Puppy, Mimikatz. And it's interesting listening to some of the other speakers yesterday. For example, Chris McConkey talked about APT 10. And today Ben talked about APT 19 and how for the first time in June of last year they witnessed APT 19 moving away from their custom tool set to depending on commercialized and open source tooling, which again makes things more difficult in delineating activity and actually tracking these groups. So I'm not the only one seeing it, and it's a definite trend. I wanted to just provide a few examples of where we're seeing open source being used by different actors, and just give you the idea that these are high value, often areas of interest where there's geopolitical conflict or high value targets. So what we'll see is a series of websites or strategic websites being compromised, and then these websites in turn end up redirecting visitors to Beef. So I'll go over what Beef is and how that's being used. But the browser exploitation framework, for example, is being used heavily. We've seen it at the Syrian embassy in Moscow. We've seen it used at the Kurdistan Regional Presidency, and in 2016 there was quite a bit of activity in that region regarding ISIS and Turkey, and there's a lot going on there. We see it in military technology universities in India. We see Russian political organizations being compromised, or their websites being compromised and serving Beef in 2016. And then more sensitive journalists and media in Turkey. So we saw it on Haber Ankara this past year. So these are all strategic web compromises, and they're all relying on open source toolkits to compromise and deploy fingerprinting technologies. So where have we seen this deployed? We've seen it in the Middle East and Europe from one particular actor. We've seen it quite a bit used by another actor, which I'll get to, in South Korea and Japan, who's also been targeting the Nordics, and then in the stands. So essentially, we've been seeing it everywhere. And there's a lot more that's being deployed, but this is what I'm going to be focusing on today. So really, how does that look at the target system when it arrives? So I've got screenshots here of some lures that a particular actor has been sending out related to what Mooks was talking about earlier. And basically, they send out these, you can see the themes here. It all has to do with employment at critical infrastructure type organizations. We've got oil and gas, energy, electricity. The senior applications engineer spot, that was, again, related to another critical infrastructure organization. But what these guys do is they come up with a macro with this, with Unicorn, an open source toolkit for enabling people to put PowerShell loaders right into macros. And they create these pretty Word documents with macros, which in turn download Puppy and in-memory backdoor, a really advanced, nice component that's also an open source toolkit, or open source component. So the macro ends up looking like this. This was one of their earlier macros that was found prior to the deployment of the actual weaponized document. So there is no obfuscation here. You'll see in the PowerShell, this is some download and execute code. This is all, again, open source stuff. And then finally, here's the PowerShell command once it's all decoded, and you end up downloading pupyrat, P-U-P-Y, from this Chrome update P resource. And then finally, here's a lot of interesting cryptography. This is all the result of open source work again, but this is the delivery of the pupyrat to a victim system. This is what you see at the web server. They're using AES to encrypt the payloads, and there's even a pretty complex password in here for delivering the component to victims. So Puppy, again, it's an in-memory backdoor. When it's being loaded by PowerShell, it's really pretty nice because it never touches disk. One of the interesting things about this backdoor is that it implements the FS3 communication stack. And that's really a Tor library, which tells you a little bit about the region in the Middle East. They think that obfuscating Tor traffic is an effective thing for cloaking backdoor communications. I think that says a lot about the attackers themselves and their understanding of how to implement like a stealthy communications tunnel. But this backdoor can implement all sorts of other communication schemes, whether it's ICMP, HTTP, IRC, whatever. It's turning out to be a really robust backdoor. It has access to the command line, and the attackers will collect system info, run other commands, and then one favorite of theirs is running Mimikatz from this tool. One of the most popular things I've been seeing over the past year was the implementation of Beef across a number of groups. It's the browser exploitation framework. Beefproject.com is the site. Basically, the sites I showed you earlier, the Syrian Embassy, the Haber Ankara, they compromise these websites. The EPT attacker will compromise the website, redirect visitors to their Beef framework. And what's interesting is Beef provides a really exhaustive capability for fingerprinting components and software within a browser, then hooking the browser, key logging, all sorts of other interesting functionality. And that's how these guys are using it. They're using it to fingerprint systems, identify who it is they're after, and then identify vulnerable components on the system. And if they can't find a vulnerable component, they use these social engineering components to deliver fake Adobe installers or fake Flash installers, fake browser installers and updates. Here are a couple of screenshots from one of NewsBeef's attacks. So over here, you'll see their fake Flash player installer that runs, and the AVG installer was, it looks like an actual install. It's a pretty well done social engineering scheme. So the groups that have been deploying this stuff in particular and completely rely on it for certain campaigns, I'm going to get into. The first one is NewsBeef. And that's part of their name. They had been deploying Beef everywhere. They compromised multiple, a dozen sites in the Middle East, and this happened to be one of them. It's one of the largest IT systems providers in the region, and they effectively not only fingerprinted systems, but sent down multiple payloads and multiple fake Adobe installers, that sort of thing, from redirects from this site in particular. It was just one of the dozen or so that they compromised. Sophacy, and this is interesting, Sophacy is known to be this well-resourced group. They can deploy a zero-day when they want. They have there's so much activity coming out of this group. At one point in 2016, now somebody else told me that they had seen this activity in 2015. We didn't see it until 2016. And it was traffic that was reserved you could tell there was some sort of IP filtering going on. We only saw it in some unusual environments in the stands, so in the Central Asian region. And that domain in particular is related to NATO info, ETHPress, other known SOPHC domains through registration information and sharing IP hosts. So in February 2016, we saw SOPHC deploying Beef, which was a real surprise. And then in July 2016, we saw them downloading actual SOPHC backdoors to some systems. So in the list of APT, where we've been seeing some heavy reliance on open source tools, APT10, which is related to what Chris McConkey was talking about yesterday, has been deploying Mimikatz pretty heavily in Japan and against other South China Sea targets. Usually what happens is Chichess, their Chichess backdoor will be deployed. They spearfish their way into an organization, and Chichess simply talks with the command and control server, and after a few sessions, the command and control server sends down a command to pull down this PowerShell script, this Mimikatz in particular, and then they dump some creds with it from GitHub. So yeah. And this is particularly interesting because there were 2 sites in Lebanon that were compromised that are related to secure identification technologies. The actor had, or the APT had maintained their injected links on this site for almost a year, I think. They weren't cleaned up, and Beef was deployed. They only had a few visitors from that were not spread out across the Middle East. It was very localized. They had very few visitors. A political event happened. Visitor traffic spiked. Everybody was hit with Beef for about a month, and then it just dropped off. The attackers at the same time then started compromising the parent site. So RGH Holdings, which owns this secure identity company, their website was popped as well, started serving Beef, and right around some political events, traffic went through the roof. So we're seeing, and this one I couldn't attribute to any one particular group. So I'd love to talk after the talk, or if somebody has more information on encrypt.com in particular, I'd be interested in finding out your thoughts on exactly who is behind this one. This is a very unusual incident. So when I talk about open source APT, the tool sets are very interesting because they're fully functional, and in a lot of the tools, the logging is verbose. So here you can see one particular actor was using, this is from a Beef installation that was being used in an incident at the end of July. And you can see the GOP, or there's GeoIP data, so they know exactly who and where the person is, where the visiting system is coming from. They know all sorts of things about exactly when the browser is regaining focus. And then you'll notice here there's key logging going on. These are Arabic characters. So there's key logging going on. You can see exactly when they start delivering these fake notifications and installing Firefox updates. And Firefox isn't the only one here. There's Chrome updates, and there's a fake notification bar for IE as well. So they've got all the browsers covered. And then, and same thing with the fake Flash update. And then a little more interesting, which they may not understand, and there's also screenshots. That's another thing Beef provides. It'll take a screenshot of the browser, so you get a full view of exactly what people are visiting, what they're doing, things like that. It's with the spider eye component. And then, of course, if they see what they like, find the victim interesting, they can send down an update to try to install a backdoor. And a little more interesting is that when they authenticate to the system, it logs exactly where they're coming from. So this is interesting because this group is known to compromise other servers and then hop into their C2s. So this IP address happened to be associated with a compromised website in Estonia. There were some friendly virtual service providers, and we were able to identify a secure shell server that they had set up on that compromised host. And from there, we were able to identify that the work of these administrators would line up with somebody in GMT plus 3.5. So as attackers are adopting more of these open source tools, they may or may not understand exactly how open source they are becoming when they're using these tools. So some of the things that we've been doing to protect our customers when dealing with beef and all these other open source tools, again, it's very difficult to track, but it becomes a little easier to protect against. We've been providing threat intel and Yara for customers who want to hunt for this stuff on their own networks. Disabling macros if people don't need them on your network. Of course, that's like macro. Who needs a macro now? Unsigned PowerShell. There are all sorts of problems with PowerShell, and this isn't really a security feature, but it's a step in the right direction. It would have helped with these sorts of attacks. Monitoring outbound traffic is certainly a big help, keeping an eye on exactly what's going on. And then finally, for things like PUPI and these robust backdoors, a robust host-based memory scanner or behavioral component that triggers when you identify when something is improperly being loaded into memory from PowerShell can really help against these sorts of attackers. So that's it. If anybody has any questions or any knowledge of encrypt, that would be interesting.
You work for Kaspersky, and so you had very good ideas at the end. Are these ideas implemented in Kaspersky antivirus?
So am I pitching product? Not completely, no, but we do offer Yara SIGs, and there are a couple of features in there that are in our product, yes. So memory scanning, behavioral-based stuff, yeah. Oh, for the PowerShell? Yeah. So yes, we do some interesting things to identify PowerShell and what it's doing to load things into memory, yeah.
Anyone else?
No crypt.
Thank you, Kurt.
All right, thank you, Brian.